In the nation that prides itself on being the land of the free and the home of the brave, there are currently 2.1 million people sitting in a prison or jail today. These people have some of the most basic rights afforded to them by the Constitution stripped away from them. Some of these rights may include the right to bear arms, vote, sit on a jury, join the military, and more. The United States hosts the largest amount of people incarcerated in the world, at 25% of the world's total incarcerated population, despite Americans only making up 4.25% of the world's population. This has not always been the case, though. In fact, the population of people incarcerated in the United States has skyrocketed by 500% since 1970. This issue in American politics is also known as mass incarceration. In this video, I will go over a simple history of mass incarceration, why you should care, and solutions to such a complicated problem. While mass incarceration began in 1970 with Nixon's war on drugs, it truly ramped up in 1980 with Reagan's own initiative against drugs. During the 1980s and 1990s, the prison population truly skyrocketed. One way to put into perspective the massive growth in the incarcerated population in the 1980s and 1990s was the number of facilities built during those 20 years. For example, in California, over the course of 113 years between 1852 and 1962, 11 institutions were built during that time, whereas in the 80s and 90s, 21 institutions were built. One of the most significant policies of the 1980s that contributed to this boom in the prison population is the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984, which introduced mandatory minimums and increased sentencing for marijuana offenses. As a direct result of this bill, the incarceration rate for nonviolent drug offenses jumped from 50K to 400K from 1980 to 1997. His administration also introduced the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which allocated billions of dollars towards the war on drugs. And this money was used to build the prison facilities, as previously mentioned, increased mandatory minimum sentences, and allocated money for treatment and drug education and for paramilitary police groups. One of these mandatory minimum sentences, which is used to explain the targeting of POC and poor communities, was the sentencing requirements between crack cocaine and regular powdered cocaine. For example, 5 grams of crack would land somebody into 5 years in prison, whereas 500 grams of cocaine would land them into prison. And this was keeping in mind that generally crack was cheaper to buy and was used predominantly by Black communities and poor communities, whereas cocaine was much more expensive and usually used by white people. Now into the 1990s, mass incarceration was in full effect and the incarcerated population was booming. The new 1994 crime bill signed into law by President Clinton would now encourage harsher punitive punishments and even harsher policing. It would also encourage states to enact 3 strikes laws, which, as it suggests, would require a harsh sentence after being charged with 3 much more petty crimes. Another provision in the 1994 crime law prohibited inmates in prisons from access to Pell Grants, which meant that vocational and educational programs would be cut. This helped reduce inmates' chances of recidivizing and increased the revolving door in prisons. Policies such as the 3 strikes laws would disproportionately affect Black people, as 45% of people incarcerated under the 3 strikes laws were Black. The crime bill of 1994 would go on to keep the population of incarcerated people growing for 14 more years, peaking eventually in 2008. Since peaking at 2008, when it peaked at 1,000 inmates per 100,000, the incarcerated population has begun to decline, where in 2019 it was 810 inmates per 100,000. However, there's still a long way to go to return to pre-mass incarceration rates, such laws that legalize marijuana, decriminalize other drugs, and reducing sentences, bringing back Pell Grants, and so forth, are showing promise to end mass incarceration. For example, in March 2021, Congress ended the ban on Pell Grants for inmates. However, there are still states prohibiting them from accessing Pell Grants. Another law that has helped to reduce mass incarceration by some numbers was signed into law in 2018 by Donald Trump, which helped shorten some sentences and bring earlier release dates to incarcerated people. Despite some marginal successes and efforts by recent politicians such as Obama and Trump to help reduce the incarcerated population, communities, especially communities with lots of people of color, are still heavily affected by economic stagnation and lack of job opportunities due to mass incarceration. And people who have been incarcerated face difficulties finding jobs, getting education, and getting public housing and food stamps to help pull them out of poverty. As a result, they often fall into recidivism at a rate of about 50% in the first 2 years of being out of prison or jail. Nowadays, the consequences of mass incarceration include a cost of 182 billion years annually for everyone, including the taxpayer, as reminiscent of the nation's Jim Crow and slavery past, as it disproportionately incarcerates Black people, thus stripping them of their ability to vote, join the military, bear arms, and so forth, and forces them into unpaid or very, very low wage labor in prisons.